We are recording, and again, this is Micah Hunt with the Virtual Presentation Friday, your host with the most, and I am supporting today's speaker with Do You Care? It's going to be a great presentation today. Again, I want to welcome you all from all over the country and in your place of work and business. We do these every week with a free CEU hour that's nationally accredited. Thanks to Virginia Assisted Living Association. Julie Moore is with them. She might give a wave. There she goes. So we want to thank them for always providing these CEUs, and just these are every week. So you get a free hour every week. So please share this with your friends, your other contacts that could use that extra hour, because time is difficult these days to get CEUs. And what's one more hour that you can get and it's free? You don't have to pay for anything, and you get some great information and get some good networking. Following this call, you'll get a thank you email from me with the recording and a survey to take your CEUs. You have 2 weeks to complete that. So please, 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 today, make sure you keep an eye out on that thank you email. It'll probably if you type in thank you, it could be in your spam, in your junk mail. So please look there as well. We just don't want you to miss out on that free CEU. So without further ado, I want to say welcome to all, and I'm going to turn this over now to our Madam of the Hour, Miss Bridget, who will be, I'm not even going to try to pronounce her last name, so I'll let you do that, with Kare, and she will be talking about the rapidly changing dynamics of the frontline workforce. Miss Bridget, I will now shut up.
All right. Hey, welcome everyone, and a big thanks to Micah. I love the energy, and not to get Micah in trouble, but I have to say he did give me a heads up before this that Peter would come in as his hype man, bring in some extra energy, and you did not disappoint. So yes, I am Bridget Kaselak, is how you pronounce that, co-founder and COO of Kare. Which we can talk about in a little bit. Now, my business partner, Charles Turner, was originally slated to give this presentation. So if you all signed up to see the great Charles Turner, hopefully I will not disappoint, and make your hour with me on a Friday morning worth it and beneficial. So I do appreciate everyone signing up and spending some time with us. So again, Bridget Kaselak, co-founder of Kare. You may or may not heard of it. We are not in Virginia quite yet, but we will be very soon. Just to give you a little bit of background on me, I am, essentially a kind of a tech geek by nature. Before Kare, I was working with a company called Touchtown, which some of you may know. Really, really cool resident engagement technology in our space. I was leading their business development. That was my first stint in the senior living industry, and I immediately fell in love with it. I loved the space, loved the mission of what our operators were doing. I met Charles during my time with Touchtown. We became fast friends. Again, I loved the resident engagement piece, but when Charles approached me about joining him to start Kare, and I knew it was a mission to help our operators get the labor we need and our frontline workers fulfill their passion and missions to care for seniors, I absolutely jumped at the opportunity. I knew it was where I wanted to be, and I haven't looked back since. So I am based in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. We also have some sunny skies today, so that's a wonderful news for a Friday. We are essentially based out of Texas, but sort of operating throughout the entire country and growing as quickly as we can to help all the folks we can. So with that, I know you guys are interested in our topic today, which is really looking at the dynamic changes in our frontline workers. We're going to talk mostly in general. Obviously, we're going to throw some things in related to COVID, but I don't want everything we discuss to be COVID related. Give us a little bit of a break from that. But we know in general, the dynamics of our frontline coworkers have changed. Frontline workers have changed in the last, I'd say 12 months, changed even more dramatically. So we'll touch on a little bit of all of it. So with that, I am going to share my screen and get us started. And Micah, if you just want to give me a thumbs up to make sure we're doing the right swap again. Give me 1 second here. All right. I am one that needs my notes when I talk. So, nope, swap it. Okay, swap it. Okay, awesome. All right, so with Kare, give you a quick overview of, well, first of all, 2 years ago, I mean, if you guys had told me that I would be here virtually presenting to you about labor problems in senior living, I would have thought you were crazy. And going even further back, 20 years ago, talking to my 20-year-old self, if you had told me that I'd be delivering a talk on labor problems and the frontline workers in senior living, but more so that I'd be excited to do so, I would have thought you were an absolute liar and ran for the hills. But here we are today, working in senior care, and there's nowhere else I'd rather be. So as much as the world has changed in about, like I said, the past 12 months, the need for quality labor in our industry has only changed really for the worst. So despite the millions of people in America that are looking for work, our labor situation has actually gotten worse. We wish COVID wasn't a thing, but here we are, we're gonna deal with it. So we're gonna get us started. Again, I am with Kare, that is Kare with a K. Our website is doyoukare.com. We are essentially, I'm gonna give you this quick overview, a digital labor marketplace. We talk to thousands of operators a day. We know across the board we're trying to eliminate the usage of staffing agencies, but without an alternative solution, that's really hard to do. So Kare is just that, bringing in an alternative solution to let us get away from those high costs and inconveniences of using staffing agencies. All right, with that, we interview everyone we bring on our platform. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is from that firsthand experience of talking to these frontline workers, what drives them, what frustrates them, what keeps them in the space, what drives them from the space. So a lot of that experience is what I hear on the phone with these folks each day in a kind of interview capacity. When we're talking about the three concerns, I alluded to this earlier, when polling our senior living executives in a COVID and non-COVID world, mostly more before though in a non-COVID world, the three greatest concerns that we always see in our space are overbuilding and occupancy. These are the things that are keeping us up at night. Labor, of course, not enough labor, trouble keeping our labor, things like that. And of course, the middle markets. Coming from the resident engagement space, again, I knew I loved the industry. I wanted to make a difference. Overbuilding and occupancy was perhaps a little too far out of my league. No one really has an answer for the middle market challenge yet, but when Charles came to me and asked me to join him on this mission for Kare, I confidently and enthusiastically said yes, because I knew labor was something we could make a change in, something we could help, and something that would be really, really impactful, again, not only to the operators, but to that frontline worker as well. So he and I put our industry experience together to create Kare, excuse me. And that is, again, sort of where we get our expertise to speak with you guys today. So we're going to talk a little bit more about Kare, but first we want to dig into some of the major market trends. We'll explore some of the sociological and psychological characteristics of caregiver. Nowhere in my bio do I claim to be a psychologist or a sociologist, but again, this is just kind of my perspective from my experience. So we're going to do a little bit of math. So if you're a math person, get excited for that. If not, bear with me. There are kind of three types of people in the world: those that are good at math and those that aren't. Actually, though, really there are three types of people. There are problem creators, problem identifiers, problem solvers. In the conversation today, I really wish I could be a problem solver. We haven't tackled that completely yet, so I will probably be talking most from a problem identifier, but we do need to identify the problems first so we can figure out how to solve them. So there are some concrete solutions in the labor that we can face that we may find interesting for you. So real quick, we're going to take a caregiver. This is actually a caregiver on our platform. Her name is Natasha. She's one of thousands of folks that work on the Kare platform. She uses Kare to pick up extra care aid shifts in her free time. She makes about $12 per hour per shift. So here's her resume. We did edit it down a little bit to fit this screen, But on top of being a licensed CNA, she also holds various jobs with FEMA on a seasonal basis. She's a licensed medical assistant and has worked as a logistics analyst in an air conditioning company. So we have hundreds of Atashas on our platform with a similar resume. People who are caregivers, but also float in and out of the industry. So for folks like Atasha, the idea of making ends meet and really surviving on 40 hours a week is really unmanageable to them, sometimes just laughable, completely unattainable. So for folks like Atasha, income insecurity is always high, and wages can be unpredictable as occupancy fluctuates. Things like COVID hit us, those wages are just unpredictable. So she's at an inflection point. She can either stay in the industry as a caregiver, or she can leave the industry and find a job that pays more like $15 per hour. And she's not getting any younger. I don't know that we share her date of birth, but she is approaching her late 40s. She wants to consider what she wants to do, if she wants to do this anymore, and what sort of retirement she could work for. So let's take Atasha's story, multiply that by thousands and millions of times. Atasha is just one woman, but that story really does repeat itself multiple times, not only over just our platform, but across our frontline healthcare workers across the board. So while we struggle as an industry how to keep the Atashas and their peers connected with our care industry as long as possible, we also need to understand that we can't ignore the fact as a society we're aging at a rapid pace. You all have probably seen these numbers, probably seen these stats. Over the next decade, as we add more and more seniors to the care system, we're also removing more and more caregivers from that very same system. Currently in the US, and this is where I get a little statistical and math oriented, but currently in the US, there are about 2.9 million caregivers, 1.6 million CNAs, and about 725,000 LVNs or LPNs. This doesn't include our registered nurses. So if you don't think that's a lot, consider this. This is actually really interesting if you kind of pay attention to things like Uber and Lyft. If you add up all of the shifts completed by these people, it equates to about 1.1 billion shifts. That has an economic impact that is roughly about 5 times the personal transportation market, which includes taxis, limousines, and again, Uber and Lyft. So while we spend a lot of time talking about things like driverless cars, we know that this market of caregivers in healthcare is much, much larger, and it's only growing from here. So according to an MIT study, and you've seen these numbers before too, by about the year 2030, we're going to need an additional 151,000 direct care workers that we don't even have yet in the pipeline. So while that number seems like a lot, it only accounts for the incremental number of people we need. It does not count for the folks that are currently in the labor pool that may be exiting. And you may have experienced this in your own buildings. We've seen a little bit of an increase in quick exodus with COVID. So according to this report, this number balloons to about 1.2 million people that will be needed once we factor in the number of people we must replace by 2028. And if that's not bad enough, we also need to factor in the 4.7 million people that will be needed just to cover the home care industry. Even now, there are about 360,000 open positions nationwide on Indeed.com. We work really closely with Indeed for our recruiting efforts, so we see these jobs out there all the time. So you really start to see the scope of this problem. Now, to take this problem, and I'm not a political person. I'm going to do my best not to be political. I promise I have no political agenda here, but this discrepancy only assumes a steady state as we are now. But what happens if we factor in policy that is unfriendly towards immigration? This happens, but then what also happens if we factor in a different school of thought that seeks to make labor more expensive, increasing things like minimum wage, and limits the ability to bring in gig workers to help us when and where they're needed? This can happen, so our economics are compounded by our policy, no matter how well intended they are. So again, we have not even factored in the potential amount of workers who may have exited the industry during COVID and may never come back. So this implication, if we don't figure something out by the year 2030, we'll have to figure out how to fill approximately the 1.5 million number of jobs. 312 million number of unfilled shifts. That equates to roughly half of the shifts currently being filled today. So let's move on from there. We don't need to look at the year 2030 to stress us out. Unfortunately, we can actually do that today. If we look at some of the stressors that are already affecting the workforce, if you have not done so, we highly recommend. There actually is a recent report from OnShift where they surveyed approximately 1,500 senior housing and post-acute care leaders about what they're already seeing. And when asked what the biggest workforce stressors are that they face, number 1 and 2 by far were around employee turnover and finding quality candidates. Certainly no surprise there. That's been the ongoing labor challenge since the beginning of time. But when asked what the impact of all of that turnaround is, or turnover is, it's clear that the caring communities were already struggling to keep up with staffing levels, which drives overtime, agency use, employee burnout, and reduces the ability to find quality care. And really, if you look at some of the top providers in our space, if you look at their annual reports, you'll see just recently, year over year, they have reported about a 7% increase in labor costs. We can't dig specifically into those numbers, and we would love to say that that is probably or hopefully due to an increase of wage. The sad truth is it's probably due to an increase in agency and overtime expenses, just to maintain proper staffing levels. All right. So when we look at it from the caregiver's point of view, we see that they also have stressors that lead to unpredictable workforce. Number 1 reason being, of course, that they have to work multiple jobs to make ends meet. They have, things like their lack of financial savings. If you've been in the building, you've seen these transportation challenges. They can't afford reliable vehicles, but they can't get to work without a reliable vehicle. Lack of childcare when their child is sick, they really don't have too many places to turn to, so that affects their ability to come to work. Having to work multiple jobs, especially if they do need to commit to a full part-time schedule without having the flexibility to fill in the gaps where they need to. And then the lack of affordable healthcare. Sometimes they just can't stay healthy enough themselves to get in to perform the jobs. So you would think, okay, can't we just raise the minimum wage? We're talking about this. This is actually, I've talked to a lot of operators who have done this already. Raise your minimum wage to $15 per hour nationwide. And again, not to be political, but just to do a little math here. If you're not a math person, again, just try to stay with us. It looks like Micah is not a math person, or maybe he's really excited about math. So otherwise, just kind of maybe tune me out and hop back in about 2 minutes here. But playing with some numbers, using the latest industry data, this is actually from ASHA, from a publication they had, the State of Senior Housing. Let's make an assumption that the average frontline caregiver in the US makes around $11 per hour. And I can say based on the folks we have on our platform, that is about what we see as an average. Even sometimes our average is a little tick higher, closer to 12. With a $3.75 premium, added currently federally mandated minimum wage of $7.25, then let's carry that premium forward in a world where the minimum wage would be $15. Taking the median data for a typical assisted living and memory care community and isolating for only frontline caregivers and med aids, we're going to get the following math. Currently, the average assisted living and memory care community, when decently run, spins off again that $15 minimum wage. We're looking at the 800 margin decline we're going to see a 27% decline in the asset valuation. So let me back up. When decently run, we spin off about 30 to 35% of an operating margin. If we take that $3.75 premium, add it to $15 minimum wage, again, only focusing on care labor. We're ignoring housekeeping, dining, activities, kitchen staff, and anyone else is an hourly worker, just focusing on care labor, we find that the average margin drops from the mid 30s to the mid 20s. When you get to this level, you're starting to approach a very, very skinny 1.0 debt coverage ratio on your ground up development. So this means that the value of the assets just declined to 27%. So when you're working with the Welltowers and the Ventas, you can see the implications this has globally on the capital markets quite large. We presented these same number to an audience not too long ago, and the question was, well, can't we just pass these costs on to the consumer? Well, maybe, but if you remember earlier in the presentation, we did talk about the middle markets. Right now, and you probably know this number as well, as an industry, we are only penetrating about 10% of the qualified senior market. So it's really not the best time to make our product more expensive. So there's a lot of conversation going on about how we can approach that middle market, but raising the labor costs would certainly make that much more difficult. So I kind of laid the macro there. So now to go into the micro, let's talk about some of the sociological and psychological factors affecting our frontline workers. I referenced these things earlier, so get down more into the nitty-gritty of that. Again, I do not claim to be a psychologist or sociologist, just reporting what I see from my time at Kare, from my time not only onboarding these folks to our platform, talking about what it takes to satisfy their career needs, but keeping them on the platform, keeping them committed to delivering their care at the communities that they are responsible for. So take everything I say with a grain of salt. Let's look at this description. Based on reading it, what do you think I am describing here? Unfavorable self-image, a lack of self-confidence, an inferiority complex, rebellious attitude, self-destructive behavior, and depression when not using, leading to inertia. So when you read that, you're probably thinking she's describing a drug addict. You would be correct. This is, very generally speaking, a clear description of the behavior of a drug addict. When Charles and I were first starting at Kare, he mentioned to me that he had an experience with a social psychologist who built a really interesting applicant tracking system. And one of the things he shared was that the psychology of a frontline healthcare worker is in many ways similar to a drug addict. That is not to say they are exact, and that is not to say frontline healthcare workers are drug addicts. In fact, it's actually quite the opposite. But this was pretty wild for me to hear. So let's take a look at these descriptors again. And instead of having the word using in that last bullet point, let's replace it with the word caring. And as you think about it, our frontline workforce, we often do see these same characteristics. A group of people, they have sometimes low self-confidence, they have a rebellious attitude, they can have a self-destructive behavior, not always the best problem solvers when it comes to their personal lives. But when they get to care for a senior, that is their drug. Really, when they get to care for anyone, folks in our space specifically have a passion for the seniors, but that is their drug. This is the time in their lives where they feel validated. It makes them feel good about themselves. It gives them confidence. And it's the time where they feel they have the respect and control over what they're doing. So again, we are not to say that frontline healthcare workers are drug addicts, but just to kind of draw those similarities to put you in sort of what we're going for here. So we're going to look at another one of a care hero. This is our friend Jackie. So Jackie is one of our heroes. She has worked a lot of shifts for us on our platform. All of our heroes have a 5-star rating. They get feedback every time they work a shift. If you talk about the psychology of those folks, think about how important that is. Every time they work, they have their manager saying, here's how you can improve, or here's what you did great at. That's a wonderful thing to have in our jobs that frontline caregivers don't always have access to. We also have things like reliability scores, which I can talk about, but really 4.21 out of 5 stars is not that great. So Jackie is a perfect example of the folks in our space. She works to put gas in her car, and she puts gas in her car so she can get to work. So you would think that Jackie would do everything possible not to miss a shift. Each dollar, she works paycheck to paycheck, each dollar matters. But you'd be wrong. Her rating is like I said, and she's notorious for not showing up. She shows up late. She gets in altercations with the community staff and her supervisors. On occasion, she's canceled the same day because she has car trouble. But when we ask the communities why they keep bringing folks like Jackie back, the response is always very same: because the residents love her. She is so good with them. So when Jackie goes in to care for the folks, that's what fuels her. It validates her. Again, it would be extremely irresponsible and wrong of us to mentally diagnose Jackie, and that's not what we're doing, but rather just describing the frequent behavior of these folks. Their cars break down, and they do very little to find alternate transportation to keep their commitments to get to work. Again, not always making the best decisions there. So in the National Institute of Mental Health estimates that the low wage earners, especially across frontline healthcare workers, are about 2 to 5 times more likely to suffer from a diagnosable mental disorder. Let's not confuse though now correlation with causation. It's not always clear what causes the other, but the belief is that in this cohort, there is a high prevalence, and compared to others, a high prevalence of paranoid personality disorder, avoidance personality disorder, and borderline personality disorder. Let's focus on the borderline personality disorder first, or only. Borderline personality disorder manifests itself in many ways, but one of the traits that is almost always prevalent is the inability to make the right decision for your own self-interest. So we often see this behavior repeated in our care workers, like I just talked about. This is a decision or a behavior that is self-detrimental, self-destructive, and played out repeatedly. You probably see these folks, the ones that have the flat tire once, probably have a flat tire a couple times a month. So these people can make decisions that seem to counter their long-term self-interest. So take Jackie, for example. We see this behavior repeated almost on a daily basis, repeatedly showing up late, repeatedly getting in arguments with the community staff. So I'm going to take a break from that and stop playing the psychologist for a little bit. Certainly don't want to get myself in trouble in any of that. Again, just drawing some sort of parallels as they are, but we're going to turn our attention to the workplace and start to examine what we see as the turnover rates that are pretty much across the board greater than 50% in our industry. There's a modern adage that floats around in LinkedIn that says people don't leave bad companies, they leave bad bosses. Generally speaking, I do agree with that, but more so, and especially for the white collar workers. We often talk as an industry about improving our cultures to drive staff retention. But when it comes to the frontline caregivers, it's a little more complex than that, a little more complex than the culture of a ping pong table in a break room or free coffee, things like that. So culture is a luxury that a lot of the staff cannot afford. So a recent study performed, I think it was the Labor Department, they broke jobs into 2 categories: good jobs and bad jobs. By every conceivable definition, being a frontline caregiver, if not managed well, can fall into the category of a bad job based on these 6 characteristics. First is low wages. We've talked about that. We know that's something we certainly see in our space. The next is the no advancement. This one seems obvious, but if you look at it a little bit differently, CNAs get their CNA license. Some of them will advance that to, find better positions in the space, up to CMA, up to RN. But typically it is, you go to work for an assisted living as a CNA, and then what's next? The next would be few or expensive benefits. So you may provide decent benefits for your folks, but if they can't afford it, then really what's the point? We could get into some differences between benefits and perks, but again, let's just focus on the benefits. Heavy workloads, we know this is true, and this problem exacerbates itself. The more we work these folks overtime, the less we can get the adequate staff they need. Their pay becomes the same, but their workload just increases and increases, and that can really be taxing, which leads to physically and emotionally draining. As much as they are passionate about caring for the seniors, that can be very emotionally draining to see the health and wellness of their patients decline over time, lose patients over time. Not very appealing for that job. And then the last we're going to talk about, we have it here as low EQ boss. I'm also going to kind of explain it as an untrained manager. So for these frontline healthcare workers, oftentimes their boss is a nurse. We love nurses. Nurses become nurses because they love caring for patients, not necessarily because they love managing people. That's something that just sort of happens as they do increase their own personal careers. We rely on nurses to care for our residents, manage care plans, make sure we're doing everything we need to do for state regulations. But usually speaking, now there's some fabulous nurse managers out there. But usually speaking, nurses have not been formally trained on managing people, especially the type of people we've talked about that are a little bit more difficult to manage with that rebellious attitude. So if you look at a bad job, you could probably agree that working as a frontline healthcare worker in senior care may be, and there are certainly things that communities are doing to push back on some of these things, which is fantastic. But what are the solutions? Okay, increase wages. Sure, of course, that's definitely an option. Maybe have different sort of lines of management, so the nurses aren't necessarily managing front staffs. Use the EHR as God intended. So this is something interesting. I'm going to take a pause here and insert a quick story. When we interview our folks, one of the questions that we like to ask is, tell us something that makes you mad at work or that frustrates you at work. And very, very often it's a high percentage, we hear the same answer. And it's when the previous, you would think it's when, my manager doesn't compliment me, or there's not enough coffee in the break room, things like that. But it is always something along the lines of when the previous shift does not complete their work. People do not love going into their shifts when the people before them have not completed, and immediately they have to start by cleaning up someone else's mess. So using your EHR, making sure that every ADL was completed and checked off by the end of every shift. Nobody leaves the shift until everyone is done. That actually is one of those things that can be a small change that makes a big impact. But another thing would be micro promotions. So they can't necessarily, get these huge promotions with huge dollars and different sort of titles, but the little micro promotions that just sort of give them, you've actually probably heard the story. There was a barbecue restaurant in Nashville, and for the folks that were doing well, it was like, arrive on time 10 times in a row, and it's this tiny little micro promotion, maybe a fun little title and a couple of cents added to their paycheck. And the last is job demarcations or internal credentials. This is actually something that Kare is going to start doing in our platform, creating things like sort of like a frequent flyer where they can sort of build up their status in the Kare platform, which we think is going to make a big impact on attracting folks in the space and keeping them in the space. All right, so we're going to switch gears a little bit, talking about work being different. Right now, we're dealing with the millennial workforce. And we hear the word millennial all the time. You hear the word millennial, you probably want to roll your eyes because you're sick of looking at millennials as a separate source. So let's go back to talking about the labor force away from the operators, talking about millennials. What do we know about millennials? What do millennials want? Couple of things they want across the board. They want to learn quickly. They want to make a positive impact. They want to do something each day that gives them purpose. They want to work for a company that has a purpose that's making a difference. They want to work for a company with culture. Millennials want to join the right culture, and they'll hunt around until they find it. They want flexibility. So typically 9 to 5 and staying with a company for 20 years is not what our upcoming workforce is really putting their focus on. They want real responsibility. Every job posting ever for a nurse says must have 1 year experience. We're in the middle of a labor shortage. We know that that's not always a luxury that we can take. They also want innovation. They want to be doing something that is new and innovative, and they want room to fail. With that, like I said, they want that feedback. Not only do they want room to fail, but they want to know they're failing so they know how to get better. They're willing to work for companies that make bets on them and teach them new skills. They want human connection. They want to have an impact not only in the world, but really with their one-to-one relationships. And of course, everybody loves puppies. Back in my days at Touchtown, when I actually worked in an office, in a physical office, we had a dog-friendly environment. It was awesome. There was always puppies running around, but what else can you say about puppies? So we thought if we can combine the needs of millennials with the more pragmatic needs of the older caregiver workforce, such as needing greater access to additional income, greater job flexibility, and the ability to find their next job, then we can leverage those needs and build a marketplace where we can solve the staffing crisis for our care communities. We have already established we're facing increasingly chronic workforce shortages, rising overtime costs and agency expenses, and very, very long drawn out hiring cycles. We know it takes on average about 45 days to hire a frontline caregiver. That takes up a ton of your time as an administrator, reading through these resumes, scheduling interviews, and then it becomes really frustrating only to have these folks turn over in the first 30, 60, 90 days. So I am going to end, I'm going to do a quick time check. I am going to end just a little bit about care, how we are addressing some of that, talk really a little bit more about what it is. We've built an app-based labor marketplace. Care matches pre-qualified, pre-screened caregivers. So that long drawn out hiring process, not on your plate anymore. We can take that for you. Pre-screened caregivers and nurses, we match them with senior care communities that have open filled shifts that can't be filled internally. So you can't fill it with your own staff without paying overtime. Your options right now are agency, which we talked about as an industry across the board. I can't hear it enough. We have a top initiative this year to eliminate agency. Well, then what do? So Kare is coming in with that alternative solution. If you look at Kare's investor and advisor base, we are very much an industry-driven initiative. I talked about Charles and I coming from the space, and that's who we also turn to support our launch, support what we were doing. A lot of industry leaders really see the benefit of having a solution like this. So if a community is struggling with overtime or agency expense, they basically post a shift on our platform, no subscriptions, no monthly fees, post a shift. And then we have thousands of heroes where we're picking up a lot of what we just talked about. We're picking up a lot of that kind of culture piece, job fulfillment piece with things like their 5-star rating, things like offering them their flexibility, letting them choose where and when they want to work. They can apply to work these shifts in their spare time. So again, they don't have to leave the industry. You talk about somebody having a full-time position at a community, probably not quite making ends meet financially. They have to go get a part-time job at an Amazon warehouse or a fast food restaurant. Those two schedules are going to conflict a little bit. With Kare, we can eliminate them. They can now control that part-time schedule. They work in their spare time. with income. So what we're doing now, the mission at Kare and how we're fixing things is income insecurity. We're providing them a way to earn extra income. Also with Kare, we're giving them the ability to find their next full-time job, or maybe even their first full-time job. So with Kare, if you're used to agency, it's really hard to hire those folks if you love them. Expensive contract buyouts, minimum number of hours or shifts they have to work before you can hire them. With Kare, and we have seen this, and this is one of the things we celebrate most, we've been able to attract people from outside of the space, partnering with schools and state associations, folks who are either just getting their certification and don't know exactly into what discipline or field they want to go in. They don't have to just put all of their eggs in one basket of one community and commit full-time to working there. They can download the Kare app, try out a few shifts at a few different facilities. Maybe they work at 3 or 4 buildings, 5 or 6 buildings. 1 or 2 of them is not a great culture fit for them, but they find one that they really, really love. They've worked there, they know what it's about, then they can get hired and commit full-time. We've been able to bring in former school nurses, folks who have committed themselves to only working home care, now bringing them into the buildings to help with our communities. So the ability to find their next full-time job is something that's been really important to them. For millennials, it gives them that precious, purpose-filled, flexible, innovative work. A lot of times they see their friends with flexible schedules, having cool apps with their companies, and they miss that. So this provides them that opportunity as well. Still don't know what we're going to do about the puppy thing yet, but for the communities, the way that Kare is helping them, this is immediate access to a labor pool. You've got hundreds and thousands of folks on our platform that you have immediate access to. You can post a shift at noon and have one of our folks in your building at 2 o'clock. You can do this at a price that's way, way less than overtime and agency. So you're really saving your operational dollars and getting the adequate staff you need at the same time. And then again, talking about hiring our folks, reducing your time that you're spending hiring, spending your precious time on much more important things, and getting people in your building without that crazy turnover. So knowing what we know about the psychological needs of caregivers, combined with the generation needs of millennials, you'll see that our narrative with Kare is very, very purpose-driven. It's about wanting to be a part of something bigger. Being able to swoop in these folks, we call them heroes. We ask them when they're going to a shift, you need to save the day. It's not about just going to work and making money. It's about focusing on the empowerment, giving the communities control. Communities get to see who they're working with, get to select who they want. So again, it's not a panacea. It's certainly not going to solve the labor challenge, but while we're trying to eliminate agencies, Kare is hoping to really get some great data and work with as many labor folks as we can, frontline caregivers as we can, and introduce them to your buildings on those emergency needed basis, but hopefully on a long-term great care, great fit kind of basis. So with that, I think, Micah, am I good on time? I think that is about it. So I would love to hear, I think we're going to open it up to questions, anything like that, or any sort of this kind of open discussion you'll want to have on a Friday.
Yep. And if you could stop sharing, that would be amazing. Awesome. Yeah. So while other people are probably trying to get their questions together, we had one at the very beginning when you were discussing the minimum wage and it increasing. And it was, how can Medicaid funded agencies survive if minimum wage goes to $15? Reimbursements are around $14.60. At $15 per hour, those agencies lose money.
Yep. Yeah, that is certainly something that as an industry, we are really, really restricted by. I mean, folks out of the healthcare space and folks that aren't working on a basis of Medicare reimbursement, they don't have these restrictions. They can increase their minimum wage and do things otherwise to offset it or fulfill it. But it's really hard for us as operators to do something as, I say, as simple as increasing minimum wage. It's not simple at all, but just for that reason, we've got a ton of regulation to work with. We've got Medicare reimbursement to work with. So I wish I had an answer for you, but I don't. All I can say is that that's definitely the challenge, just because we have so many outside forces around us sort of restricting and regulating what we do. And we don't have the freedom to sort of create these great cultures and great benefits packages and pay wages.
Hope that answers your question. Okay.
It certainly doesn't. I wish I could.
So does I'm going to try to ask this other question. I'm going to do my best, but the person will email you and follow up with you as well, but they just wanted to at least have a discussion about it. So early on in your conversation, you were discussing about, what was it? Hold on. Let me look at my chat here. Hold on. Mental health issues. So is there any correlation, or can you explain, or do you all do anything with trauma induced frontline workers? So it may not be mental health, but it's trauma from another community that has kind of impacted them in the same ways that you're kind of explaining it, but it's not mental health, it's more of a trauma.
Yeah, certainly. So we don't do anything just yet. Again, we are a startup. We launched our business about 2 years ago today. Our product went live in October. As we grow and as we kind of stabilize the foundation of our process, we are looking to add much more like kind of hero support programs and, just kind of life coaching and things like that. So we don't yet, and as far as even seeing it, even related to the mental disorder stuff, none of that is proven or directly correlated. And I think especially when it comes to trauma, that's probably even more so hush hush for these folks in terms of having difficulty speaking about it. So if that is the case, we don't necessarily even hear about it. I'm sure it's out there. When you talk about these behaviors like rebellious attitude, self-destructive, that can absolutely come from trauma from a previous position. But we don't have any of that kind of very explicitly reported to us or able to provide any sort of coaching or anything on that.
Okay. Again, the person that asked that will probably follow up with you in regards to that and dive more into that. But I thought it was a good conversation starter to hear, because mental health, especially now, has evolved so much than what it used to be even 10 years ago. So I think that the more we can discuss and kind of keep it out of the closet, the more we can be more open to it and find ways to, fix it, solve it, have solutions instead of just always having a problem with it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that falls too into the little subcategory of, I hate to say that a frontline care worker and senior care is a bad job, but if you look at those classifications, it's a bad job. One of them being physically and emotionally draining. That trauma certainly leads to that emotional draining part of it. So that's certainly something we should, be able to talk more openly about.
So somebody just chatted a question, and it was, many new hires have a sense of entitlement. How do we work with that? Yeah,
that's a tough one. And we see entitlement more and more. I would say, my thing would be try our best to nurture that and sort of satisfy that for them. And something, an example might be a little bit of those micro promotions or those micro incentive things that you can afford to do that don't necessarily cause, tons of payment increases on your payroll, but just, setting up fun programs that aren't perks and benefits, but just something to satisfy that sense of entitlement for them, manage it the best we can, but give them a little bit of satisfaction in it in a way that, that works for your operations.
So the person elaborated, I am talking more about those that do not perform and want more.
Yes. That's a tough one. That's a tough one. When we hear, from my experience, and that's all I can speak to, when we hear folks that are heroes that go into buildings and don't want to work, don't want to do the jobs that are asked of them, For us, that's just as simple. You're not cut out to be a care hero. Now, I know at the community level, that's a little bit more difficult because you guys have put a lot of work into hiring these folks, and you can't just dismiss them after two or three shifts. So folks that don't want to perform but want more, it's not as easy as just eliminating them from the head count and eliminating their position. But maybe that can also be managed as kind of giving them micro jobs. But also back to the point I made earlier about the previous shift completing all of their work. Sometimes we see that as a snowball effect. If the person before me didn't do it, why do I have to do it? So when we can really create some processes that hold everybody to the same standards and make sure when they come in, everything was done, all the med charts were complete, all the meds were passed, everything was cleaned, all the beds were changed, everything you need to do, then I think people do kind of have a little bit of self accountability. Absolutely. Kim mentioned accountability in the chat, and when one person can get away with not being accountable to their job, then everybody thinks that that's where the bar is lowered. So as managers, we really need to make sure we're holding everybody to that. The job is not complete until it's done. And then you might see slowly, and it won't be an overnight change, but slowly everyone will step up.
Yeah, and the person before Kimberly, I'm gonna butcher your name. Kanchana. Did I do it right? No. You can unmute yourself. I want to hear how you pronounce it. Go ahead, unmute yourself.
It's actually Kanchana, but call me Casey. Everyone does.
Okay, Casey. Okay, I'll do Casey. So Casey said the frontline workers know that the facility needs them. So many really push the envelope.
Yes, and that is something, that's a great point, and something that is only exacerbated right now with COVID. It is hard for us to appreciate and celebrate these folks as heroes for the selfless work they are doing coming into our space. They know that they're becoming much more of a valued employee for us. And so it's really hard to manage that. What we're seeing right now, I'll kind of this again, I can't answer these problems in a way that is helpful for you to take anything actionable back, but we see it across the board. Around this time last year, we had folks that were just calling off more from their shifts. So we called it the tax refund flu. When you're working paycheck to paycheck and you get a little increase of, a $400 tax refund, that matters. That's a big deal to them. So working the next two shifts wasn't as important because they didn't need the money. We see that more now with the stimulus checks that they're getting back. So they're being celebrated. They know they're valuable. They're demanding bonuses. They're demanding increase in pay. And it's one of those things that of the millions of things COVID has sort of created extra problems for us for. That unfortunately is just another one we've seen where we've asked folks, people that 2 months ago were working 4 or 5 shifts a week with our platform, and then they stopped, and we would call them and say, hey, what's going on? We noticed you haven't picked up shifts. We honestly had one person say, I'm rich, I don't need you guys anymore. And that was her and 2 of her dependent stimulus checks they got. So my hope there is that it is a temporary thing as COVID settles down. But at the same time, we do also need to value the work that they're doing, those folks who have stayed in our space through these times, to value them and appreciate what they've been doing. But it is a really kind of rocky road while everything with COVID settles down. So it's a great question. Again, I'm so sorry. Another one that I cannot answer, but only empathize with.
We're coming up to 12 o'clock, and I know a lot of people have another appointment. A few people have already had to leave, so I don't want to delay you all. But remember, you will receive an email from me following this call. So if you weren't able to ask your question or you didn't feel like your question was answered, please follow up with Bridget. You will have her contact info, and have the conversations going. That's why we do these every week, because not only do you get to see you, but now you can connect and network with the speaker to gain more insights, more information, have the dialogue, figure out ways to collaborate with each other and make it better, because that's what we're all here to do. We're trying to help our seniors and especially our caregivers in a very difficult time. So please, please, please continue the conversations after this. Don't feel like you have to go, all right, it's done. I didn't get my question. I'm going to stop now and never reach out. Please reach out. Bridget is expecting emails, so please email her.
Yeah. And we do, for the folks still on the call, sorry, Micah, real quick, our website again is doyoukare.com. That is care with a K. Throughout all of COVID, again, we've got thousands of caregivers on our platform. We want to take advantage of that and collect as much data as we can. So through COVID, we did survey them at the beginning, middle, and about 2 months ago, which we were hoping was the end, to ask them how COVID is impacting not only their personal lives daily, but their relationship with their jobs and healthcare. So if you're interested, I would invite you, please go download our COVID white paper to get a little bit more perspective from the view of our frontline caregivers.
And with that, I'm going to stop recording.